Good morning, everyone. My name is Marcella Hardin, and I'm a first-year PhD student here at Georgetown University, studying the history of immigration policy. I am here today with Professor John Tutino to talk about his book, The Mexican Heartland. Professor Tutino started teaching at Georgetown in 1993. He teaches for both the History Department and the School of Foreign Service, and is also the director of the Americas Initiative. Professor Tutino has published 4 volumes and has edited or co-edited 4 others, with his work focusing on Mexico in its global context. Thank you for being with us today.
Happy to be here.
So your book, The Mexican Heartland, focuses on 3 phases of capitalism, gracefully moving from the global perspective to the local influence. I just wanted to start by asking you how your life and your work has led you to focusing on the histories of popular communities.
And that's sort of the earliest and most enduring focus of what I've done. To be honest, I'm a child of the 60s. And so I'm undergraduate headed to grad school, simply certain that if I was going to do history, what mattered was the history of the way everyday humans lived. And that didn't mean you didn't study power, but you studied everything else to understand the evolving ways that everyday humans live. I can add to that quickly a scene from when I was 17 years old in Celaya, northwest of Mexico City, where I was dragged by a friend to an optometrist office. And this was my first ever, second week maybe in Mexico ever. And sitting there, walked in, first thing I saw on the wall, an aerial photo of the entire complex of the American Optical Company in Southbridge, Massachusetts, which was the corporation my father worked for, and it included my Boy Scout cabin. And while I'm still being blown away by having seen that in Celaya, this fellow walks in classic campesino garb. And I, on my way to college, say, to myself, I'm this intelligent young man, I'll talk to this person and be kind. And it took about 4 sentences for me to discover that this minimally educated campesino was a smarter, more philosophical, caring human being than I had ever met. And arguably, I can say my whole career is chasing what I encountered in that room. First and foremost, to understand everyday folks, but second, to eventually see it in the context of global capitalism. And quickly, that's the way it's evolved. I have been from day one focused on deciphering everyday life. Over time, I figured out that power didn't just impact everyday life, but everyday lives impacted power. And thus it's a negotiation, and they shape history. And then over time, and this is much more recent, is really sometime in probably 2008, 9, 10, when I suddenly figured out that the context I needed was global capitalism. And I'll just leave that there.
Great. Can you speak a little bit to the relationship that you discuss between capitalism and patriarchy in your work?
Yeah. How will I put it? If my early work, with one exception, if you look at my first book, the unit of analysis was always the community, which is a wonderful way to avoid stratification within the community and gender within the community. And it wasn't like I wasn't aware at that time, because I'd already published my first article on men and women contesting power within the Mexico City elites. Actually, I had given a paper at the challenge of a distinguished woman historian of Latin America, Asuncion Lavrin, that she heard about this material and she said, if you'll write this up, I'll get you on the program at the Berkshire Conference for Women History. This was in the 1970s. And I was the only guy on the program. Though Asuncion did me the huge favor of inviting a couple of other guys as commentators. So I wasn't left in the position that so many women were at that point of being the only voice from a perspective there. Anyway, I had started to figure out I needed to study it, but I did not begin to have the sources to look at it below the level of elites or across the board. So my first book, which was on variations of when, why, and how communities turned to insurgency across Mexico, I just sort of fudged it. And I will say, I knew I had to get to gender. And if I didn't know it, I had graduate students I had undergraduates at Carleton and St. Olaf. I had graduate students when I was at Boston College. I had even more graduate students here who reminded me very politely and regularly that I should get to gender. And if you read my prefaces, I thank them explicitly. I give people like John McNeil for bringing me to global perspectives. I give my graduate students, my students, credit for drawing me to gender. As I kept studying this in this time and place, and I'm not going to argue that this is the universally necessary or most useful approach, but as I came to realize I needed to capture what I was doing in the context of the clearly hierarchical powers of capitalism, I realized, and my sources were telling me this, and I sometimes wonder how did it take me so long to see it, that the gendered power I was seeing was not first, foremost, and primarily inequalities between men and women in families, communities, etc. But the key gendered power were hierarchies of male power. Men to men to men, hierarchies of patriarchy, in which powerful men said, I will make this available to you if you will work for, serve for, da-da-da-da. Owners did it to managers, managers did it to intermediaries, intermediaries did it to laborers, tenants, etc. And that, so hierarchies of patriarchy really shaped the functioning of what I came to call capitalism in this area. And that then those hierarchy of patriarchy functioned to keep women subordinate at each level. So it was the oligarch male's ability to have this series of dependents, which his wife couldn't have in most cases, that then kept her in a situation of luxury but dependence. And as you go down the hierarchy, it works all the way to the cultivating household. One of the things I've been able to document is, with a few pivotal and rare exceptions, land, for example, is almost only leased to men with about a 90+% probability, which guarantees that tenant households will be patriarchal. And wage work, before the 1880s, I have literally never seen a woman paid a wage in rural Mexico. We're not talking about the cities at this point. And again, the combination of that, and in indigenous communities, men had priority and access to community land, which meant the whole system is structured. It's not just a cultural prejudice. It's a structural implementation of patriarchal power, top to bottom, that then functions, and I would argue structurally aims to function, to keep women subordinate at every level, and to keep women separate. So powerful women don't interact with working women on a regular basis. And then I will say, I take great joy in highlighting the exceptions. And throughout the book, there are exceptions. There are particular exceptions for powerful women, because unlike in the Anglophone world, unless you do something exceptional, inheritance is partable. Widows can be exceptionally powerful, or a woman who successfully avoids marriage and inherits can be exceptionally powerful. And the first article I ever wrote was because I found the 5 years of personal correspondence of a young woman who refused to marry and ended up the manager of the largest set of landed estates in central Mexico. And she was a hard-driving, in-your-face manager, made money like it was going out of style, and knew she had to keep a doddering old man as an employee, so when she had to go out in public, she would set the doddering old man too. And I would never have known this, except I literally had her draft letter books for 5 years. And over time. So that's sort of the approach I came to. It evolved over the years. I first really worked it out in the book Making a New World, that deals only in the Spanish era in the Bajío to the north of this region, and then brought it in and complicated it here.
So, in looking at Mexico and indigenous communities and popular insurgencies in its global context, what led you to focus on the heartland and not other regions of Mexico?
In part because, and I will say, from day one, this has been my primary focus, though this 2018 book is the first book I wrote on this region. But as an undergraduate, I wrote a thesis on Zapata's revolution, which is the southern basins of the heartland. So the goal was to explain why those communities took arms and made such a mess of things for everyone else for 10 years after 1910. And I thought I'd done a brilliant work, and then just before I submitted it for honors, John Womack at Harvard published Zapata and the Mexican Revolution and taught me what I didn't know. And that's a good lesson for every young historian, is to have somebody do that. So I decided that he had done an amazing job on the movement itself, but he really hadn't gotten into the social origins, the long-term problems. I thought I would do the half century before the revolution, and realized nobody would make sources available in the 60s and 70s. No, oh, you want to look at my family papers? We were those bastard landowners that the revolution took on. Sure, come on in, name me in your study. So I went back to the 18th century, and same region broadly. So in fact, the first article, which was a seminar paper, not before my dissertation, was on the Chalco region that shows up here throughout, and if you took a look at chapter 7, there's about a 6 or 7 page subset of that is an updated synthesis of my first ever 1970s HAHR article on Chalco after independence. And then my dissertation was on the region. And for all kinds of reasons, I both kept looking at other regions and kept doing studies. And so I would somebody would say, we need a conference paper, we need an essay for a volume. Would you do something on the 17th century? All right, we do something on the late 19th century. And so I did these case studies over the years, never published the dissertation, which had, how will I put it, maybe, I've never counted, the most cited never published dissertation in Mexican history. Actually, once the great Argentine Berkeley historian of Argentina, Tulio Perin, in a review essay on the economic history of Latin America, says Tutino's dissertation is one of the best studies we have. Why didn't he publish it? Anyway, so I'd been doing this region, but I got focused for a variety of reasons on the region to the north. And the key difference is the heartland, and what always drew me, it was the greatest concentration of pre-Hispanic power. The city of Mexico Tenochtitlan, 200,000 people, power holders, markets, right? It revives. It becomes the greatest concentration of wealth and power in the Americas from 1550 to 1810. It briefly is larger than Potosi. I mean, it's Potosi in the Andes is briefly larger. To this day, it's the largest urban conglomeration in the Western Hemisphere. But what always struck me is that huge center of power tying it to the first within pre-Hispanic times, then to the Western world, is surrounded by the densest, most enduring, most adamant population of indigenous communities. So I got to study the maximum interplay between indigenous communities grounded in the land, saying, no way, quite often, and periodically, I hope you saw, getting away with it, and the greatest concentration of power. So that I emphasize the Bahia, which I studied, is basically New Spain and Mexico beyond Mesoamerica. It does not have a base in historic indigenous communities. So the European commercial world got to create itself anew there in the context of the global silver economy. And regions to the south of this, despite a lot of studies that don't quite recognize it, have powerful, enduring indigenous communities and no meaningful Spanish economic or power presence. And thus the indigenous sort of carry on. So the goal here for sort of these long-term looking at different issues in different places to look at the maximum interplay between what I would have really called European state and commercial power, and I'm just now happy to call capitalist power, and indigenous communities who actually are not opposed to participating, not opposed to claiming gains. Those of you who've read the early part know it was actually indigenous people who started the first silver mining boom, and we know about it because of all the Europeans' complaints that they weren't getting what they thought. They should be in charge. Why are we letting these indigenous peoples do this? And a variety of other levels. People are willing to participate if they can participate on their own terms, if they take gains and are not wholly subject. And at a couple of points in time, and two of the chapters in the book, one on a particular region after 1810, and then focused on the whole Zapata movement after 1910. At key times, these people more than said, let's negotiate. They took up their machetes and said, maybe not. And a few heads rolled, and that is one way to get power holders' attention. And historically it's happened. So, and then the book ends, and I might add, I was telling some of my folks in my class last night, the original book, based on my long studies, was going to quit after the revolution in 1920. And sometimes things you can't imagine happen. After Princeton accepted it, gave me a contract, my editor, who was the editor-in-chief, says, don't you want to just write a whole other section on the 20th century and bring this to the present? I'll give you a year. And I went, how can you say no? So the whole part 3 of the book was sort of bring it to the present. That's the tale of the book.
So in the last couple minutes that we have left, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the sources you used. You look at the book looks at year 1500 all the way to 2000. So in this wide time frame, how did you approach the sources and what challenges did you face?
And there's even an epilogue dated October of 2016, the last tour for pictures through the region. The key was the questions stayed pretty consistent. Capitalist power, global connections, and how indigenous communities insisted with some success on making the system adapt to make it at least livable for them. And the argument of the book is they had meaningful success really from day one till about 1950. And then the modern world of the wonderful technological good has absolutely crushed them in the last 50 years. And that's been for a lot of people the unhappiest conclusions, the unhappiest outcome for me, but to me it's necessary. But all that required different sources. So for the period under Spanish rule, Spain and New Spain, and particularly New Spain, was one of the richest places in the world. Its archives were incredible. And it maintained a separate judicial archive for indigenous peoples when they fit indigenous courts. So indigenous people could sue Europeans, have their own translators, their own public defenders, etc. It not only tells something about the way the world worked, but it created all kinds of records. So mostly I was able to use records of empire engaging these people for most of the period under Spanish rule. Then in the 1780s, I started to find, and there are some tales about how that happened I don't have time to go into, that first the University of Texas, then I discovered at Washington State University, have collections of the family papers of some of the most powerful mining and landed oligarchs who were really central players from the 1780s till the 1860s and 70s. And for the key period of why it all collapsed in insurgencies, 1780 to 1820, I had the intersection of the fine Spanish state sources and the amazing private family business collections. Business correspondence, inventories, anything you could want. Then, of course, in 1820, thanks to the insurgents in the Bajío, the Spanish state collapsed and state record keeping all but dissolves in Mexico. You can't rely on state national archives for the first half century. But I had these private papers. And so they became, and they're the private papers of powerful landowners who were also meaningfully important political actors. And so it really gave me an entree into that post-independence period when everything newly contested, and to be honest, the state and the commercial economy are collapsing, and the communities are saying, in your face, back off, we're taking care of ourselves right now. And these powerful people are really upset about that, and so they recorded very nicely. I hope you enjoyed having discovered more recently the angry priest of Iztacalco. Talk about in your face. He's a priest who is so hated by his that he sits in a balcony window and writes down everything he can see about the community that hates him. And he's really a good recorder. Hate may be a really focusing situation. So that gave me stuff through the middle of the 19th century. All those family papers fizzled out. Again, the people who were the victims of the Mexican Revolution don't make their papers available. And then, literally walking through the stacks at the Latin American collection at the University of Texas, and by the way, their library for Latin America has larger holdings than all of Lowinger for all things, so it's where I have got to do so much of this. I saw these big volumes up on a top shelf, and it said Memorias del Estado de Mexico. And it turned out to be amazing. The state of Mexico, which is the state that surrounds the capital, thus it's the heartland, minus the city, had started doing these amazing statistical compilations on land, birth, death, power, and I was able to suddenly take up quantitative analysis of family, gender, etc., thanks to the fact that this being such a central region, the state had the capacity and the interest to do this. And at the end of that, the memories of people interviewed by anthropologists showed up. This was also one of the most favorite places for anthropologists to go starting in the 1920s. And they talked to people about what was going on from the 1880s, 1890s on. So the end of the book mixes sort of these state materials with the voices generated by anthropologists. And among the reasons, obviously for interest, the later sections focus on the region of Morelos where Zapata was, because that's where the great conflict, the great change, etc. was. But it's also where the anthropologists all went. So I had the voices. And the good thing was the anthropologists were male, female, Mexican, US, one Italian woman who Lola Romanucci, who married Ross. And she has an amazing, I'll end you with this tale. So I love this cover. I tell people, Diego Rivera came out of the grave to paint my cover. In the book, I tell the tale. Diego loved indigenous Mexicans. He had a country house in the heart of what he was sure was indigenous Mexico. Lola went to study there and discovered it's an entirely Afro-Mexican community, having come out of a sugar plantation environment. And he had not encountered or discovered or lived among, not that the Afro-Mexicans had married with Native Mexicans, but it is no way a primarily, but it also then becomes a wonderful episode for all of this. So yeah, the key is to do the long term. The questions could stay, but the sources had to change. And last thing, anthropologists should be used as primary sources. Critically, just like you'd use a visiting official or a visiting missionary or anybody else, but they go local, they have first sight, and they record voices. Take them as yours, criticize them, but use what they bring in.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today, and thanks everyone for listening.